continue to be crazy and non-stop killing machine of the Assad regime continue to be like this, it's very difficult to have real negotiations or real talks in Geneva. The international community has to do something with that, otherwise actually that's giving a green light for non-killing, non-stop killing machine of the Assad regime to continue to do the same as it is in the last 3 years.
Ammar Waqaf, the US had called for the UN Security Council to condemn the violence. Now that was thwarted by Russia. Do you believe that kind of a strong stance is needed?
Well, I think the international community and everyone else needs to understand that the current government offensive in Aleppo and around Damascus comes at a backdrop of indiscriminate shelling of mortar shells that kill tens of people on a daily basis. Now, before coming to the studio, I was talking to a friend from Aleppo, and he said that actually, due to the government's last offensive, the shelling, the mortar shelling from opposition areas into government-controlled areas has actually was actually reduced a while. So it seems that the government offensive is having an effect. I wish, obviously, as a Syrian citizen, that the government uses more precision weapons in civilian areas. I do hold the opposition fighters responsible for the death of civilians because they simply, camouflage themselves as civilians. They go into civilian areas and they take civilian areas to be their command and control centers, not only command and control, but actually, fighting centers. So the government has to do something about it to protect its citizens. I again reiterate the wish for the government to use more precision weapons rather than, shells that can kill civilians as well.
I'd like to go back to Ule and talk about this point we brought up about international response. What kind of international response have you seen, and is it anywhere near enough?
Well, it is obviously not enough. I mean, what we've seen is from some governments condemnation and outrage of what has happened. But I think the problem has really been that everybody has been so focused on, first of all, the chemical weapons issue, then it was the humanitarian assistance issue, which is still a very, very concerning topic, and then the political talks that were announced. And in all of that, the sort of the gradual increase we saw in the bombardment sort of fell off the agenda a bit, and it had to be sort of a massive bombardment attack on December 15 that actually caught people's attention. The problem is, of course, that Human Rights Watch has been calling repeatedly for the UN Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court, to impose a weapons embargo on the government, to adopt sanctions against officials. But we saw just yesterday that even producing a statement condemning the use of these very indiscriminate weapons in a populated area, weapons that have killed hundreds of civilians now, even that was too difficult for the Security Council to agree on. And the problem is, of course, Russia, that has been objecting to any kind of statements, any kind of actions that would mention or put pressure on the government.
Radwan Ziadeh, would the opposition fighters agree to an arms embargo?
It's unfair, actually, when we talk about an arms embargo. Even that this issue is not on the table, because what the Assad regime or the Assad forces using actually the state institutions to kill its own citizen. And this is why I feel I laugh when I hear someone actually talking about protecting the civilians, where actually 150,000 has been killed by the airstrikes, indiscriminate shelling of all that areas. And the story of Homs, the story of Aleppo, and the story of Damascus suburbs, it's full of civilians about that. And this is an important, unfortunately, that the international community does not care exactly about the fate of the civilians. And this is why we're talking about a war within civilian areas. Aleppo, it's considered like in the UNESCO as one of the oldest city on earth. And this is why the fighting has been in the different neighborhoods in the old city and all of that Well, this is not only the reconstruction. Today, I think Al Jazeera and others bring the photos of what's happened in a Kennedy hospital. It's a hospital being used as a military base of the Shabiha and the Assad forces.
Okay.
And
As you're speaking there, I want to bring in some pictures of the impact of those barrel bombs. And as our viewers can see, the devastation is widespread. It has caused a lot of panic, a lot of injuries and deaths. And as we were mentioning earlier, there's no precision to it as to even where it was targeted or whether it was targeting military installation. Regardless of what the intention was, the fact is civilians have been maimed and killed in these attacks. Now, I want to ask Ammar Waqaf about this. The issue of using crude weapons, improvised weapons, have always been a method for the opposition fighters. But now the regime, which has been well armed up till now, has started using these kinds of weapons. Now, is this a change in tactic?
No, I disagree. These kind of bombs have been used actually since you know, at least a couple of years. I mean, we've seen pictures before. I disagree with using them in civilian areas. I wish, again, reiterate that the government uses precision weapons. But let me go back to what the gentleman from Human Rights Watch mentioned. I think Human Rights Watch, since the very beginning of this crisis, have been looking through one eye. So, for example, in the past week in the city of Adra, near Damascus, the opposition fighters went into the city in the middle of the night, and then they threw the bakery, for example, workers into the bakery oven alive. Nobody in Human Rights Watch wants to talk about this. I'd really be fascinated to wait and see whether it's ever going to come up in one of their reports. They seem to be pretty much occupied in incriminating the current Syrian government. But what is happening actually is that they are ignoring all the shelling that is taking place from the opposition areas into civilian areas that are controlled by the government. And again, this has been happening for months now in Aleppo, in Damascus, and so on and so forth. And the Human Rights Watch really are not bothered by this, but the international community, when it comes to the Security Council, and this really probably is an answer to his surprise why the Security Council is yet to condemn the Syrian government. The people in the Security Council would have to be faced by both sets of facts. And what they see as well is that, you know, the opposition fighters, especially those who are radical and Islamic, you know, extremist ones, do not really care about human lives and so on and so forth. And someone will put the argument that the Syrian government has the duty to protect its own people. And, you know, for that, they need to fight. And if the opposition fighters, you know, take control of a civilian area and they turn it into a military base, then they will have to be fought over there. So obviously that will have collateral damage. My understanding of the situation is that should the Syrian government really be interested, or had the Syrian government really been interested in killing civilians, the death toll within civilians would have been much higher. There is no carpet bombing, there is no, you know, I would say, consistent indiscriminate targeting of civilians. There are military operations. On the, you know, in parallel, we have, unfortunately, civilians who are being killed.
Okay, let me allow Ullah Solvang to respond to that, and I believe that's probably what you wanted to ask him. You heard the argument there. What's your response?
Well, I think there are two things to say here. First of all, I would strongly suggest that the gentleman speaking before me have a look at our reports, all of our reports, because we have actually reported extensively on abuses by government group, opposition groups as well. We were one of the first groups, Human Rights Watch was one of the first groups more than a year ago that issued reports on the use of torture and executions by opposition groups. In the report that came out today, where we spoke about the bombardment of Aleppo, we also documented indiscriminate attacks by opposition forces into government-controlled areas. Just 3 or 4 weeks ago, I personally was in Damascus and Homs to document indiscriminate attacks by opposition forces into government-controlled areas. So to say that we are turning a blind eye and that we're ignoring these opposition abuses is definitely not correct. And when it comes to the bombardment that has been taking place in Aleppo by government forces, I think there are absolutely no doubt that this is at the very least indiscriminate and at worst perhaps a deliberate attack on civilian areas and civilians. I have been on the ground in Aleppo at different times since August last year when these aerial attacks happened. I've been very close to some of the attacks when they happened, and I saw with my own eyes that there were, in some of these cases, no military targets close by, no opposition fighters were killed. And so either the Syrian Air Force is incredibly incompetent at targeting what they're trying to target, or they don't care about civilians getting killed in the process, or they are deliberately targeting civilian areas and civilians. In any case, what the Syrian Air Force and what the Syrian authorities have been doing in Aleppo are very serious violations of international law, and they are committing war crimes.
Radwan Ziadeh, I want to ask you about opposition fighters targeting or having indiscriminate targets too, and possibly ramping up the ante without much thought for civilians. Do you have any control over opposition fighters on the ground? Is there any dialogue?
Yeah, just me first to comments actually on targeting the civilians by the government forces, because the type of the weapons has been used against the civilians. Basically in Aleppo, we call TNT barrels. Would just actually
we've spoken about that already, and Ule has also outlined what the government forces are doing. I want to talk about what the opposition are doing on the ground.
Yeah, but my comments here that those actually type of weapons has no targets. This is, they just throw it out from the
what kind of weapons are you talking about?
From the helicopter or the fighter jets. The TNT barrels, which full of the TNT, it can explode in the civilian areas.
Doing. Opposition forces too are fighting, are hurting civilians, are making crude weapons that also don't have any precision.
Yeah, let me comment here on the opposition. Of course, the opposition, they don't have, of course, the airstrikes. They don't have the long-range missiles who has been used. What the opposition has been used, which indiscriminate shelling of some of the areas in Homs and in Damascus, and that's really something unacceptable. And we are in talking with the different armed opposition leaders. I just back from Syria 3 days ago in Idlib, which I have talks with the Free Syrian Army, with the Islamic fronts, and all of that about actually the misuse of the indiscriminate killings, which has consequences on the international law. But we have some difficulties, of course, addressing all of these issues with the armed opposition when you would have non-stop killing machine, as I mentioned, and the airstrikes every day, which make it, of course, unbalanced and make it very difficult for the civilians on the ground to understand what's the point exactly when we're talking about indiscriminate killings by comparing to the airstrikes, everyday airstrikes hitting civilian areas.
Given that, Radwan, world leaders are going to get together. They're going to talk at Geneva too about a peaceful solution to this. Is there really any point to this then in that case? I mean, you have opposition fighters already saying that they aren't going to comply. Is there any point of getting together and having this so-called peaceful dialogue when on the ground, as you say, they're being attacked, there is constant fighting, and they find no reason to change their tactics?
I mean, if the Assad continue in such kind of the attacks, especially in Aleppo and in other areas in Damascus suburbs, which make Geneva impossible for anyone to attend, the Assad need to change the calculation on the ground before going to the Geneva peace talks. Well, this is, of course, unacceptable, and this is the responsibility of the international community to do some actions. Unfortunately, the international community, they failed even to have non-binding presidential statements by the Security Council. Well, this is why we are going to Geneva with no hope that the Geneva can achieve anything. And this is why the international community, before pushing the opposition or the government to go to the Geneva, they have to take an actions for the government to apply. Especially until now, we never heard any statements by the government or the Assad militias about accepting to form a transitional governing body. But this is actually the issue. It has been negotiated in the Geneva too.
Ammar Waqaf, and as we're coming to these talks, these so-called talks on peace, fighting on the ground has been intensifying within Syria, we've seen, and particularly in Aleppo. What do you think is the reason for that?
Well, I think the key player at the moment in Syria, apart from the Syrian government, is actually the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia seems to be in sort of fear of total loss. They feel that they've invested a lot, actually since 2003, in this, and especially from the start of the crisis in Syria. And you have the Iranian agreement of nuclear power on one hand, you have the Syrian agreement on chemical weapons on the other hand, and they feel that the Geneva talks, or Geneva II, will only result in the current Syrian government remaining in place, or at least, or worst obviously, at least giving it a little bit more time to live. So I think the Saudis at the moment are going towards prolonging or a prolonged sort of struggle. We've seen unifications within the factions of the opposition under some Islamic banners. The leaders have actually went physically and met with the Saudi officials under the guise of pilgrimage and so on. We've seen more commitment to funding and what have you. And we've seen separate attacks, especially in the Qalamin area. I disagree on the Aleppo being the intensification. I think that's pretty much local and in response to the increase in mortar shelling, which has reduced actually as a result of operations. But in Qalamon, in Nabik area, in Deratiya area, in Adra, in a place, for example, like Sednaya, you have opposition fighters going in and out very swiftly in order to cause carnage and mayhem. So there seems to be this doctrine now of fueling resentment amongst the people rather than keeping key strategic areas and liberating them as they did before.
Okay.
And
we're running out of time, so I'd like it to leave it on the thought of the people and the resentment among the people that you brought up, and bring Ule back in and talk about, now, while all these talks are going on in Geneva, while diplomats are sitting around a big table figuring out how to bring about peace, what are your main concerns about what's happening on the ground?
Well, our main concern is, of course, that the violations continue, both by government and opposition forces, as we have documented. In addition to that, what we're also seeing is a horrible humanitarian situation where thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, are trapped in very, very difficult conditions, and where, again, both the Syrian government and opposition forces should play a greater role in facilitating access for humanitarian organizations to deliver aid. And we're not seeing that. I mean, to me, the issue around the chemical weapons really showed what was possible when the international community, including Russia, agreed on something and put pressure on the Syrian government. And I think we need to have that same sort of agreement now, first of all, on the humanitarian assistance issue, making sure that civilians in Syria get the food and medicines that they're in need of, and at the same time putting pressure on both the Syrian government and opposition forces to not violate international law and to stop killing civilians. That's what needs to happen.
And with that, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for coming on the program. Ole Solvang, who's a senior emergency researcher at Human Rights Watch, Radwan Ziadeh, member of the Syrian Opposition Syrian National Council, and Ammar Waqaf, who is a political analyst. Thank you all for your time. And this discussion comes to an end. Thank you, viewers, for watching Inside Syria. And that's all we have time for. Thanks to our guests, Ole Solvang from Human Rights Watch, Radwan Ziadeh from the Syrian National Council, and Ammar Waqaf, who's a Syrian political commentator. Stay with us here in Al Jazeera. Here's a reminder that you can always keep up to date with all the latest developments from Syria, along with in-depth analysis on our website. That's at aljazeera.com.